Hi all, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Ellie Boyle, and I'm a freshman at Bowling Green State University, as well as the chair of the Human Relations Commission. On the screen right now, you will see our program, which can be viewed by the QR code or on the City of Bowling Green website. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 33rd Annual Drum Major for Peace Award, celebrating the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. The Martin Luther King Jr. holiday celebrates the life and legacy of a man who brought hope and healing to America. Today, we commemorate Dr. King's great dream of a diverse nation united in equity, peace, and reconciliation. On this holiday, we celebrate Dr. King's values of mutual respect and interracial camaraderie that Dr. King and other civil rights activists fought for. Tonight, we celebrate with musical acts from the community, keynote addresses, and the celebration of an outstanding community member. Now, please welcome Mayor Mike Oshbacher, the mayor of Bowling Green, who is providing opening remarks and leading us in the Pledge of Allegiance this evening.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Ellie. I'm really happy to be here with everyone this evening on this important day for this important event. I want to take just a minute to thank our keynote speakers and everyone that's watching this event on the city's YouTube site. I also want to take a minute to say thank you to the members of the Human Relations Commission for organizing this evening's event. They've shown a great deal of creativity and resilience over the last couple of years in finding a way to continue this tradition by holding these events virtually. Like you, I'm hoping that next year things will have improved and we can once again gather as a community in an effort to recognize this very important day. So with no further delay, I hope that you'll join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God.
Thank you, Mayor Oshbacher. Next, Human Relations Commission member Anna Brown will be leading us in Lift Every Voice and Sing.
Lift Every Voice and Sing was first set up as a poem by James Weldon Johnson, and then was set to music by his brother, John Rosamond Johnson. It was first performed on February 12th, 1900 at the Stanton School, which was a segregated school at which the brothers were employed. It became so popular that by 1919, all of the NAACP decided to make it the national anthem, the Black national anthem. And so without further ado, I will be reading to you the lyrics to Lift Every Voice and Sing. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat, have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed. We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out from the gloomy past till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who has brought us thus far on the way, thou who has by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee, lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
Thank you, Anna Brown. Next, we'll have a piece from the Magicals. The Magicals are an audition group selected from the top chorale students at Bowling Green High School and were founded in 1966 by longtime Bowling Green chorale director Jim Brown. Members are in grades 10 through 12 and include athletes, thespians, and honor students. Every year, they give over 25 performances at athletic events, community events and meetings, and school concerts. They have traveled to perform in Chicago and New York and are looking for more travel opportunities in the future. They are under the direction of Mrs. Beth Vaughn, who is in her 8th year as Director of Chorale Activities at Bowling Green City Schools. They are performing a piece entitled Free at Last. Thank you, Magicals, for that special performance. In a year of triumph and tragedy throughout the United States, some topics can be difficult to navigate. This year, in the Ohio State House, House Bills 322 and 327 were introduced to put significant strains on the events that can and cannot be taught in the classroom. It poses the question if we are really representing Dr. King's values, if we are not paying attention to all voices throughout history. Here to speak to us about equity in education tonight is Ariana Bustos. Ariana Bustos is a 21-year-old student and teacher candidate at Bowling Green State University. She was born and raised in rural Northwest Ohio. Ariana Bustos is in her last semester of undergraduate student teaching and majoring in adolescent to young adult education. In the last 4 years, Ariana has spearheaded several diversity and inclusion initiatives, including professional development, curriculum development, and organizational work. Her passion for teaching is driven by the lack of diverse representation and culturally responsive instruction in her K-12 experience. Ariana's teaching philosophy is rooted in the desire for future students of color to have an authentic representation and equitable teaching practices. Ariana has also made it her life's goal, by any means necessary, to unapologetically advocate for marginalized students' rights to liberating themselves through pursuing an education. As a woman, student, and teacher of color, Ariana believes education is a tool to freedom, and because of that, she will always be a lifelong learner and book lover. Her future after graduation is to attend graduate school at Bowling Green State University to pursue a master's degree in curriculum and teaching. Thank you, Ariana Bustos, for coming to speak to us tonight about MLK's influence in education.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. That was very wonderful performances that we saw. Everyone is very talented in that group. Thank you for having me here tonight. I am so grateful to be here and to share this special day with all of you. So I'm going to share my screen. So let's see if this lets me do it. Okay, great. Let me minimize that. Zoom is tricky. And also, if you guys hear meowing in the background, ignore it. My cats are not enjoying anything lately, so it's hard to get them to not be crazy cat animals. So Since I am an education major in my undergrad at BGSU, everything that I do is related to teaching. So I wanted to focus on MLK's legacy and his influence on American education. And I focus specifically on equity in my presentation, and I will get to why that is in just a minute. And so Emily kind of already gave, or I'm sorry, not Emily, Ellie already gave a about me. So I do different work at BGSU surrounding culturally responsive pedagogy, curriculum development, teaching frameworks, all that stuff. And I spend a lot of my time focusing on students of color, how to support students of color, how to support teachers of color. And I advocate a lot for social justice issues in education. So I was very pleased to be here today and kind of continue on that conversation in regards to how culturally responsive education is a direct product of Martin Luther King's legacy and activism. So this next slide kind of puts into perspective equity versus equality. So let's move this. So before I get into defining these two different terms, I'm going to define culturally responsive teaching because I will reference it maybe like once or twice later. So culturally responsive teaching is defined by Geneva Gay as using the cultural knowledge, prior experiences, frameworks, frame of reference, and performance styles of ethnically diverse students to make learning encounters more relevant and effective for them. This framework applies to curriculum design, professional learning, and classroom instruction. So when I was creating this presentation, I was thinking about how different education was in the 50s and 60s versus now in 2022, especially that most of our learning now takes place virtually on Zoom. So I thought about equality versus equity, and I've done multiple different essay writes over this because I think this is a really important topic that applies to Martin Luther King's legacy. So equality means each individual or group of people is given the same opportunities or resources, and this is achieved through treating everyone the same regardless of need. Whereas equity recognizes that everyone doesn't begin in the same place in society. Some people face adverse conditions and circumstances, making it more challenging with the same effort to achieve the same goals. This approach addresses and allocates resources varying on the individual and their cultural history. So we know equality was King's biggest push during the Civil Rights Movement. This was because Black people did not have basic human rights before the law. Equal treatment and having initial access was the first obstacle to knock down back then. However, just as times change, so do our needs as people. Socially and politically, things have changed drastically since the 60s, and educators across the nation questioned whether equality is enough or for our students, or should we progress to another foundational principle? MLK's legacy is bound to influence social justice activists for generations to come, but it is our job as learners to utilize the essays and wisdom of activists such as Martin Luther King and mold their philosophies to fit what our communities and students need in our current times. So I kind of was on this path of equity versus equality for quite some time in my undergrad, and I think it's a very interesting discussion, especially how it pertains to the activism behind Martin Luther King's advocacy. And so for me, students don't just deserve equality in education, they deserve equity, which, for example, demands that we be seen as Black learners and be given history, literature, and pro-Black teaching frameworks and practices. We deserve more than equal treatment and accessibility. Equality is kind of the bare minimum. We all deserve the access to education regardless of skin color. However, Black students need treatment and accessibility that pertains to their specific cultural and historical needs in education. I think about equity versus equality in this way. You give a group of students the same access to education. However, within said education, you have systemic issues such as the school to prison pipeline, disproportionality, which is inequitable discipline, and Eurocentric white-based curriculum and teaching practices. Students of color, including Black students, are not having their needs met with these different oppressive forces working against them in K through 12 and even higher education. This is where the principle of equity currently is addressing our racially diverse students and the systemic forces within our education system through culturally and historically responsive teaching frameworks. So I know that probably was a lot of information, but sit with it for a minute. Kind of think later on equity versus equality. I first had to spend some time thinking about that a little deeper. But next, I wanted to introduce a snippet from a newspaper article that Dr. King wrote in his time in undergrad at Morehouse College. So he was a writer for his school's newspaper, which the newspaper was called the Maroon Tiger. And in 1947, he wrote an essay titled "The Purpose of Education." And in this essay, he wrote, "Education must enable one to sift and weigh evidence, to discern the true from the false, the real from the unreal, and the facts from the fiction. The function of education, therefore, is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically." And because MLK brought forth many new progressive ways to view the purpose of education, his views and pursuits of higher education were influential in terms of Black representation and leadership in academia. His progressive views on education and being passionate about academia in the 50s and 60s is why today many Black people are able to see themselves succeeding in academic spaces. The representation and voice MLK has to encourage the youth, especially Black youth, to utilize education and literacies as a tool of liberation cannot be denied. And I was very impressed by this quote. I read the whole essay, but this quote stood out to me the most. And so when I was also creating this presentation, I learned a lot while creating it, but and it was a very inspiring presentation. So I really enjoyed this creative process. But I was thinking, who influenced Martin Luther King Jr. Before he became like a full-fledged activist? Like, where did these ideas and philosophies start to foster? Who was he getting these inspiration? Well, who was he getting his inspiration from? And so I thought that was important to start with to understand him a little bit more. So the first person would be Howard Thurman, who first introduced the concept of nonviolence and civil disobedience to Martin Luther King Jr. And so civil disobedience was one of Dr. King's core philosophies in the civil rights movement. When designing his activist approach and philosophy, he was heavily influenced by the likes of transcendental authors such as Ralph Waldo Emerson or Henry David Thoreau. And Henry David Thoreau actually did write Civil Disobedience. So because of Howard Thurman, King was introduced to one of his favorite and inspirational transcendentalist authors that he used quite often in his own social justice advocacy and the work that he did. Which I didn't know that he was really inspired by transcendental authors until I did this presentation. So I thought that was interesting because I'm an English minor and I teach English. So it kind of is interesting to see how that all comes full circle. So the next person that Martin Luther King was inspired by was Benjamin Mays. And so when King was a student at Morehouse, Mays was the president of his school. He was a prominent educator and Christian minister, and he became one of King's mentors in his early life. And King spoke very highly of him, considering him a spiritual mentor, an intellectual father. And so Mays would hold weekly inspirational morning sermons that were meant to challenge his students. And for King, these sermons were unforgettable. So it's very interesting to see how he has different people that inspired him in different ways. And I actually didn't know he had like a lot of different mentors, but Benjamin Mays was one that was very prominent for him. And the third person is Mordecai Johnson. So Mordecai is part of these different civil rights leaders. And so they worked together in a lot of the different movements that were happening in the 50s and the 60s. But because of Mordecai Johnson, King was introduced to Gandhi's philosophy. And Gandhi is also another person, like literature person, that King utilized very frequently in his philosophy and activism, which I also didn't know and thought that was very interesting. And so because of Mordecai Johnson is where King's interest in Gandhi's philosophy was sparked, which later did become a heavily influence on how he conducted his speeches and activism for civil rights. And I also learned that Mordecai Johnson was considered the most prominent Black religious leaders of the time. So a lot of inspiration coming from many different Black leaders in this time that are very inspiring. And the fourth and final person or not the final, because I'm sure there's more than four, but for this presentation, the last person would be Bayard Rustin. So Rustin was also doing similar lines of work to King in the 50s and the 60s. He spearheaded the Montgomery bus boycott, assisted in that. He advocated for the same beliefs and activist work that King did. And he was also the deputy director and chief organizer of the March on Washington. And I didn't know that either. So I thought this was very interesting to see. A lot of the people that King was influenced by were people that he was so close working with all of the time. And I think that's amazing because a lot of the people that I work with in terms of my diversity and inclusion initiatives, I'm very much inspired by them. So I think these four different people that King is inspired by is very interesting to see how they had that sense of friendship before he became very inspired by the work that they do. And so because it's this ripple effect in how activism works, who are you inspired by, and then who do you end up inspiring? And so I wanted to then shift to who was inspired by Martin Luther King Jr. And these are just a few. Again, I don't think I could fit all of the people onto one presentation, but it's probably millions of people that he's inspired. But this is just a few that I wanted to capture. So we have John Lewis, which is a former congressman and civil rights activist. And then we have Barack Obama, who is the former 44th president. Forrest Whitaker, who is a former teacher and activist. Actor and activist. And Neva Mae Pittman, who is the former teacher and activist. And then Frankie Adams Johnson was a former Black Panther member. Dorcetta Taylor is an environmental sociologist at Yale School of the Environment, and she focuses on environmental justice and racism. And Fred Davis is a former councilman and renowned businessman, created the first African-American independent insurance company in the 6 states in the South. And then Bruce Boynton is a civil rights activist and one of the freedom rider pioneers. And I think all of these people are very inspirational, and it would really make sense why they were all inspired by Martin Luther King as well. And so these are just a few people that I found that were inspired by King's work. And John Lewis is somebody that passed away in 2020, but he has a book. It's called March Book 1. It's a 3-part series, but I really recommend it to understand how much he actually was influenced by Martin Luther King. It's a very moving and powerful story about how he was influenced and inspired by Martin Luther King's unapologetic activism. And I think it's an amazing book, and I would really suggest that for everyone to read. And so my next slide is another quote. I'm pretty sure it's from the same essay. Probably should have put that in here, but it's a really good quote regardless. So it's a quote goes, "The complete education gives one not only the power of concentration, but worthy objectives upon which to concentrate." And we know Martin Luther King had many objectives in his line of work, but the foundation of his legacy was to ensure accessibility and equal education, employment, and housing opportunities regardless of the color of one's skin. More specifically, his objectives were built on the foundation of Blackness through being driven by his personal experiences in witnessing of injustices and mistreatment inflicted upon Black Americans. And this is another quote that you could think pretty deeply about, because if you think about it, education can be very powerful, but it can also kind of tell you what to focus on or give you inspiration on what objectives you want to concentrate on in your line of work. And so my next question, rhetorical question to think about, is who inspires you to be knowledgeable on race issues and social justice advocacy? I also put at the end, you might be carrying on MLK's legacy, because I believe people that are in the line of diversity and inclusion work are carrying on a small part of King's legacy in different ways. And while creating this presentation, I thought extensively about who inspired Martin Luther King and then who MLK inspires. And then it led to a ripple effect. Who did MLK inspire? Obama, John Lewis, etc. And who did those people go on to inspire, and so on and so forth. I know for me, I was heavily inspired by John Lewis, my third year in undergrad, which was just a year ago. I was captivated by Lewis's drive to obtain an education by all means necessary. Without MLK, Lewis would have likely found education as a tool for enlightenment, but he would have struggled finding community and Black-centered leadership. I believe for Black folk, especially, it is vital to our survival to have community of resistance. One of my favorite quotes comes from Bell Hooks. She says, "Those of us who live, who make it, passionately holding on to aspects of that down-home life we do not intend to lose, while simultaneously seeking new knowledge and experience, invent spaces of radical openness. Without such spaces, we would not survive. Our living depends on our ability to conceptualize alternative, often improvised." In this essay, Bell Hooks speaks on marginality as a space constructed to oppress, and we, the people who are racially marginalized, have to change the way we view the systems and spaces which were made to keep us locked in or keep us out of. We may operate under machines, but we have the power to deconstruct false oppressive narratives about who we are. These oppressive constructs we were once told we had to stay put in are now a space of radical openness for us to create our own narratives and live in our truth. These new spaces we create as if it's second nature are for us in the margins to heal, love, and learn. MLK was the flower that bloomed to show us that these spaces are possible. We just have to find them. And if we cannot find safe spaces, we will create them for us, by us. And so my last slide is kind of my inspiration to kind of say, if you're not fully in line with social justice advocacy or staying aware on race issues, it's not too late to start. It is never too late to start some sort of level of activism and being engaged with your community and being educated on the problems happening around you. I know for me, I experienced that firsthand in undergrad. With most things in the realm of social justice, it takes conceptualizing and personal connection to carry on the rigorous work of social justice leaders. In my experience, I would like to think I have carried on a small part of Martin Luther King's legacy through my time here at BGSU with ICRE and friend support, and in student teaching, using my many different culturally and historically responsive teaching frameworks and theories and theorists. We have this culturally responsive framework for utilizing education as a tool to achieve justice and educate the youth on race issues because of Black activists like Martin Luther King Jr. If you know me, or if you don't, now you will, my teaching aspirations in philosophy, I specialize in English, but I am passionate about social justice learning and teaching. I am most experienced in creating, teaching, and implementing culturally and historically responsive teaching frameworks in classroom settings. I recently read a book by Goldie Muhammad titled Cultivating Genius. She spoke about the limited rights Black people had in educational institutions. She wrote, "Rather than wait for their rights and education to be granted from those with legislative power, they instead created their own agendas and claimed authority by organizing into professional associations focused on literacies." This quote is the act of resistance and the influence MLK's legacy started in education. Stepping back and realizing this education is a start, but we need and deserve an education that represents us and our community authentically. So carrying on a legacy is more than just agreeing with an individual's philosophy. Carrying on a legacy is extending on their philosophy and introducing an appropriate modernized approach to their concepts. Carrying on a legacy is to ensure you are taking action on issues you are passionate about within your community. So I leave you with this question to think about. What is your objective in either teaching, learning, or obtaining an education? And who inspires you to continue down this path of pursuing your objective? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ariana, for agreeing to speak to us tonight and for all the work that you're doing in our community, and we know you'll continue to do. Next, we will hear from our other keynote speaker, Mojibang Kamala. Mojibang Kamala has been the coordinator of Welcome BG since it launched in 2018. Mojibang Kamala hails from South Africa and has been in the United States since 1978. This background drives her passion and commitment for immigration issues, beginning with her membership of Welcome BG, specifically their task force, which led to her current position as coordinator. She has an undergraduate degree from Ball State University in political science, criminal justice, and criminology, and a master's in public administration, criminal justice administration from the University of Toledo. She worked for years in law enforcement in Lucas County and later started an interior designing business here in Bowling Green. She enjoys volunteering for causes dear to her heart, like the Wood County Hospice Center, for the past 13 years. Mojibang Kamala will be speaking about her experiences immigrating from South Africa and a reflection upon the experience of Dr. King throughout history.
Good evening. Not in our town, thank you for the invitation to be among the speakers this Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And to the attendees, thank you in advance for the privilege of your time. I Have a Dream is the most known speech by Dr. King, but in preparing for this event, I found myself gravitating towards a lesser known address that he presented in Detroit, Michigan, February 28, 1954, titled Rediscovering Lost Values. The poster promoting tonight's event quotes the words of his wife, the late Coretta Scott King. It states in part that we commemorate the values he taught us through his example. It goes on to itemize the following values: courage, truth, justice, compassion, dignity, humility, and service. On the surface, I dare say we are all in agreement that these are indeed the values that we preach, attempt to uphold, and use as a standard to judge people's morals in their absence. Sadly, looking at all his speeches, one can plug in January 17, 2022, and any city across this nation. The message is still relevant. Where he was advocating for the Negroes, one can plug in immigrants, refugees, LGBTQ communities, people of minority cultures and backgrounds, and the message is still relevant. The needle has not moved much. The MLK that we celebrate today is the one that we have repackaged for marketing, when in reality, he was a bit of a controversial and radical figure. He was threatening to many who wanted to silence their own guilt. He was threatening to those who were comfortable with the status quo. He was terrifying to those who did not want to see the little Black boys and Black girls joining hands with their little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. This was a man who was under the FBI surveillance and wiretapping. National Security Agency was monitoring his communications. He was under the CIA surveillance. The man who the Hoover administration accused of communism. Not exactly the kind of guy that you will name a holiday after and uphold as an example. I came to the US in 1978. My father was a political activist against the apartheid regime in South Africa. He was the founder and executive director of Black Community Programs, a political and community organization. And when his life was threatened, we left the country and went into exile in the neighboring country of Lesotho. And making a decision to leave one's country is probably the hardest thing one can do. And do not ever let anybody tell you differently. It is not a decision that is made lightly. It is gut-wrenching, and one has to weigh the pros and cons and yet still chooses to step towards the unknown because the present conditions are sometimes a matter of life and death. One leaves everything she knows, friendships, culture, foods. Yes, as insignificant as it may be, it matters. Language, and often family. And as you depart, there is no way of knowing if you'll ever see your family members alive again. We were fortunate to live as a family unit, which is not always possible for those in exile. We entered the US on a refugee passport issued by the United Nations, UNHCR. When one lands in this country, you are nothing but just a number, if that. Your previous background, position, status, all of that means absolutely nothing. You literally start from scratch. Upon our arrival, we lived in Cleveland Heights. My dad went to Case Western Reserve University, where he got his MA and PhD degrees. My mother was a certified midwife and an RN nurse and worked at Cleveland Clinic. She was our only primary financial source throughout all those years that my dad was in school. He knew that he needed a job to contribute towards the household, but everywhere he went, they told him he was either overqualified or didn't have experience, at least verifiable experience in the US. Even though my mother had been a practicing RN as long as I could remember, she was hired at the Cleveland Clinic as an LPN, and she was then required to sit for the US exam before she could be an RN in the US. And she did exactly that and worked as an RN until we left Cleveland. My husband is also an immigrant from Tanzania, East Africa. He has been employed by the same company since 1989. We have 3 children, a son who's a graduate of St. John's and attended St. Louis University in Ohio State, a 25-year-old who is a graduate of Maumee Valley Country Day, holds a BA from Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, and currently is a graduate student at NYU. And the last one is also a graduate of Maumee Valley with a BS from Boston College. And currently she's an associate strategist for a marketing and advertising company agency in New York. My experiences as an outsider and as an outsider in Bowling Green have been both good and bad. We have been members at St. Mark's since we got here, and they have been a constant family to us. We have made a lot of friends there, and we have served in various capacities as members. However, I must touch on the not so good stuff, as I feel it is crucial to share if we hope to attract diverse community, particularly ones of marginalized communities like immigrants and the people of color, to our community, which is what I'm tasked with as a coordinator of Welcome BG. I had the honor and privilege for 13 years to volunteer for Wood County Hospice, giving much needed breaks to caregivers and holding hands of many who were transitioning in this life. For me to be scheduled, the office had to ask the families if they minded that I was Black. Many families expressed not wanting a Black person in their homes, and I was only glad to honor their wishes. I believed strongly that God would send me to where He wanted me to serve, and the others did not matter. I had someone ask me if my son went to St. John's because he had a basketball scholarship. Just for the record, he is the least athletic person I know. But think about that question. Every time my husband is wearing BGSU jacket or gear, there's always this question: are you a coach at BGSU? Now, you would say, what is wrong with that? But think about it. A neighbor said she had gone to the Maumee Valley Country Day's website to check the cost of tuition and wanted to know how could we afford to send our girls there. Again, think about that one. As a store owner, I got most of my business from outside BG. I later found out that my store had been labeled in town as an African store. I guess that depends on what your opinion of Africa is. That was a way for you to decide whether you're going to patronize the store or not. My store was defaced quite a number of times, spray painted with words I will not dare to repeat. The police were notified, and to this day, there was never any follow-up or communication if the perpetrator was ever caught. Once, I had a couple of men who came inside my store as their cars were being towed from blocking the store's entrance. They went on calling me all racist and derogatory terms they could ever think of. I finally had to call the police, but once again, time was spent lecturing me than dealing with those men. I had a neighbor who did not respond to any greeting, even though at the edge of the driveway and we shared the mailbox. 3 years later, they finally spoke, and only then because my daughter helped their daughter who was failing a class. To this day, they speak only when they feel like it, and we have been here since 2000. I got stopped by the police for a legitimate reason, mind you. He looked at my address and asked me, how could I afford to live on a street he couldn't afford to live on his salary? Again, think about that. I still receive questions to this day, where did you learn to speak English? Or if I had grown up with animals roaming the streets. I wish I could say those were questions from the children. Sadly, not. Then what is the point of me sharing this? Simple. It is to illustrate that in spite of what is being said and how immigrants and people of color, especially Black people, have been portrayed in the political arena and social media as poor criminals, only here to deplete the US government programs and resources, which is simply so far removed from the truth. The immigrants that I have known over the years are as qualified and many more, far more qualified than I ever will be. They are driven to succeed. They work tirelessly, even the jobs no one would take, and still go to school. Immigrants are not the enemy. We are constantly painted with the same brushstroke. We are not one story. Each immigrant is as unique as his or her story, as unique as the country one comes from, as unique as his or her background, talent, and skills. In my household alone, we have 2 immigrants, which meant 2 totally different stories. As immigrants, they are, however, what things that we do have in common. We carry our families that we left behind in our spirits. We are motivated to succeed in their honor. We want absolutely nothing different than anyone in here, and that is to be a provider for our families, bring up healthy and honest children, and be contributing members of our communities, both here and in our homelands. This is just a fraction of what we experience, not just as immigrants, but people of color in Bowling Green. This and more happens right here in our town. It is possible to reside in Bowling Green, but because of your profession, economic status, and networks, one has a completely different experience. However, that does not mean that these incidences do not take place. And I'm just only one of many stories. We do not wish to be tolerated, and the definition of tolerate is to be put up with. Do not get us off the shelf only when needed. Do not get us off the shelf when your organization only needs to qualify for grants. Do not get us off the shelf when you need to be marketed as diverse and inclusive. Now, having said all of this, if there was a community that can handle it, it is Bowling Green. Bowling Green has the tools and the heart to tackle and face all the issues that threaten to unravel our town. Groups like Not in Our Town are driven by citizens of this town to stand up against any injustice and ill treatment. Bowling Green can stand up against anything that does not reflect our values. Then why is it necessary to bring up the negative occurrences to attention? As Welcome BG, we are painfully aware that we are unfortunately in a unique position where the lack of workforce is threatening our economy. The US population has flatlined. Any city that has seen any population growth has had an increase in immigrants and people of diverse backgrounds in their communities. While many US born are retiring, the immigrants are of working age. These are the demographic trends in the 20th century. Businesses are suffering labor shortages, and the economy locally and nationwide is at risk. So if we're looking at various pools that include attracting the immigrants and the international students, we have to be willing to listen and face the uncomfortable truths. We have to be aware and be intentional in being inclusive, in being hospitable and welcoming. Let us give them an opportunity for them to get to know us, to get to know Bowling Green, and to get to experience the wonderful, strong, and supportive community that it is. In closing, I'll leave you with the words from the writer Adichie. She says, "Do not create a single immigrant story. Do not see us all as one thing. Seek to hear and learn many more immigrant stories. The consequence of a single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and humanize. Stories can break the dignity of people, but also stories can repair that broken dignity. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Until every person in this country, regardless of color, race, religion, and background, can confidently utter those words, the needle has not moved. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us, Mozartbang, and for sharing that important message. Without further ado, I am proud to introduce the Drum Major for Peace Award. The Drum Major for Peace Award is given to a citizen of Bowling Green who has made significant efforts to further the betterment of human relations by actively promoting justice, peace, and respect, and who exemplifies Dr. King's character of value and courage, truth, compassion, dignity, humility, and service. Choosing one member of our community was not a difficult task, and we appreciate all those who sent in nominations for community members. This year, the Human Relations Commission is proud to award Beatrice Maya with the Drum Major for Peace Award. Beatrice Maya is the director of La Conexión and the founder of the Northwest Ohio Immigrants' Rights Network. She works with organizations such as Advocates of Basic Legal Equity, as well as many Wood County entities such as the Wood County Hospital, Wood County Health Department, Bowling Green State University, the Cocoon, and the Brown Bag Food Project to advocate social justice and help for those in need. Beatrice Maya has worked with the City of Bowling Green and public officials to create and adopt anti-discrimination ordinances throughout Bowling Green and worked with the Bowling Green Law Division to reform law enforcement practices. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, she organized the vaccine clinics for the Latinx community and translated important COVID information. It is my honor to present the 2022 Drum Major for Peace Award to Beatrice Maya. We invite Beatrice to say a few words.
Thank you, Ellie. I don't have a lot of words to say. I'm still inspired by the words of Ariana Bustos and my colleague and dear friend Mojaveng Kamala, who did a fantastic job as speakers of this wonderful event. I just want to take a second really to express how honored I am in receiving this award. Is certainly not only an honor, but it's also a big responsibility about continuing the work that we have been doing with La Conexión. And I'm very appreciative of everybody who was involved in deciding to award me this recognition. First of all, my nominator and dear friend, Linda Lander, and also the whole Human Relations Commission of the City of Bowling Green. And of course, the City of Bowling Green, my hometown. I'm very appreciative for this. And I don't want to forget about thanking the members of La Conexión and all of our colleagues and volunteers who have been collaborating with our work and making my work possible. So thank you so much. And thank you for a fantastic program today.
Thank you, Beatrice, and congratulations again. Next, we have a special musical arrangement from Ariel Kasler, who will be performing songs from the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Ariel added that he, quote, chose to play 3 African-American songs that were performed during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, in which Dr. King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. Another speaker at this event was my great-grandfather, Rabbi Yoachim Prince, who spoke immediately before Dr. King, expressing the identification and solidarity with civil rights movements, and that stems from Jewish history and teachings. Ariel Kasler currently holds position of assistant teaching professor at Bowling Green State University, where he teaches jazz piano, guitar, and jazz courses. He also leads the Ariel Kasler Quintet and is a member of the BGSU faculty ensemble, as well as the Thompson-Kasler duo. Ariel holds the Master of Music and Jazz Performance from Bowling Green State University, a Bachelor of Music from Berklee College of Music, and an Alexander Technique teaching certificate from the Toronto School of the Alexander Technique. Ariel will now be performing pieces from the March on Washington. Thank you, Ariel Kasler, for that beautiful piece. I would like to thank my fellow HRC members, Anna Brown, Akiko Jones, Emily Dunapace, Tyler Thompson, Carol Bell, Melanie Van Dyne, Anthony King, Steve Nape, and Justin White for all their hard work and dedication to our program tonight. The Human Relations Commission would like to take the time to thank the City of Bowling Green, our keynote speakers, and our awardee for their help and support of the program, as well as all of you for joining us this evening in remembering the life of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.